Just found a 20 on the ground. This is not like setting up my sermon or anything. It was just laying there. So if you're missing a 20, come find me afterwards. Otherwise, I guess I just got a raise. They say ministry doesn't pay. All right, it's wonderful to be back with you this week. I'd like to kick us off a little bit with a bit of a history lesson, a bit of a walk down memory lane for me as regards this place. The Well started about 7 years ago, and it was a group of students. It was a small group of people who were musically talented and who loved Jesus and wanted to worship together. And so they started to gather and sing, and it was called Thursday night worship at the time. I'm not sure if that was an official title or if that's just what people called it, but it started to draw a bit of a group because it filled a void that existed on campus at that time. There was nothing like this midweek on campus in those years, and so it grew relatively quickly. And the students who were leading it reached out to one of my predecessors, Thomas Fitzpatrick, who was a campus minister, and asked him to help them create a space where people could come together to worship Jesus. And they could worship him regardless of their denominational background, regardless of their history, regardless of their doctrine. It was a space to come and worship Jesus. So that is how the Well started, and that is what the Well has been. And it transitioned, I think a year and a half in, from Thursday night worship to the Well, which I think is a little bit catchier. But we got that name from the scripture that we're going to be looking at this evening. And to make a long story short, and we'll get into the details in just a second, but Jesus had an interaction with a woman at a well, and he filled her up to overflowing with living water that could only come from him, and sent her out overflowing, and she just bubbled that and spilled it all over the people around her and built them up and pointed them to Jesus. And that has always been our prayer for the Well, that it's a space where Pepperdine students can come from wherever you're at. You can show up full or show up empty and be poured into, so that you can go out throughout the rest of your week and love each other well and draw near to Jesus. And that is always our prayer for the Well. But as I was rereading this story that we are going to be in tonight from John chapter 4, I kind of had my get real glasses on because my mind has just been kind of steeped in this theme that we're going through this semester, and I noticed some things that I hadn't really noticed before in this story. So we're going to dig into it a little bit. It starts in John chapter 4. We're starting with verse 5, and the scene opens with Jesus leaving Judea and heading up back to where he's from in Galilee. And Judea's down south, Galilee's up north, and there's really two ways to go. One goes straight up the middle. Shortest distance between two points is a straight line, and you can go straight up, but that takes you through a place called Samaria. Or you can stay in Israel and circle around and avoid Samaria. It does take quite a bit longer, but that's the way most Jews would do it, because a good Jew would avoid Samaria at all costs, because Samaria and Samaritans, the people who lived there, were bad news. Several hundred years before Jesus was there, Samaria had been ransacked and conquered, and the people who had conquered Samaria had taken away all of the elites, the rulers, the best looking people, the smartest people, and these were all Israelites at that time, and they had taken them away and left behind the people who were kind of the lower, the dregs of society, right? These are people who are just trying to survive. And these people didn't have the same hang-ups as the upper crust did about marrying outside the Jewish bloodline. So they started to pair up with outsiders, and by the time Jesus was there, Samaria was populated by a mixed breed of people who were from all over and who still worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God of the Jews, but who did it in a different way that was influenced by all sorts of different outside cultures and religions as well. So for the Israelites, Samaria was bad news. And it was exclusively populated with impurity. And so, if you've been paying attention over the course of the semester, you might not even have needed to hear this story or to know this story before to have a good guess as to which route Jesus would take to get up to Galilee. So far, he has shown that he picks the route, he picks the setting, he picks the place, he picks the person that brings him in the most contact with brokenness and impurity in people, then restores that there. So Jesus goes straight up the gut into Samaria. And they're walking up, they're getting tired. It's high noon, it's the 6th hour, it says, and they're getting tired. So they stop for a breather at a place called Sychar. And Sychar is also known by the name of Shechem, which, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, is a site of a lot of epic action scenes and some really gnarly, gruesome, brutal stuff. And that's kind of neither here nor there, but it is an interesting place to learn about. And we see that Joseph had been buried. That's not Jesus' dad, Joseph. That's Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph. And he's buried there. And Jesus stops at this well that Jacob had originally been associated with. And Jesus stops, and since it's noon, the disciples go for their lunch break, so they head to town to find something to eat and leave Jesus there alone. And this woman comes to draw water from the well. And the disciples must have taken the group water bottle with them because Jesus is thirsty, and asks this woman for a drink of water. Now, this is a no-no, all right? In order for a rabbi, which is what Jesus was, a teacher, in order for a rabbi to do what a rabbi did, he could not interact with Samaritans. That would ruin his credibility. Not only that, but a rabbi who was married couldn't even talk to his wife in public. So to talk to a stranger woman was even more taboo. And so for Jesus to say this, I mean, this is so typical Jesus, right? He's breaking these cultural norms. He's addressing this Samaritan woman. So it's unsurprising to see that she is shocked. She's like, whoa, what's going on? She says, how is it that you, a Jew, asked for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? She's a little confused by how this interaction is going down, because she knows what Jesus should think of her, right? If I had to guess, I would guess she also had some pretty choice thoughts about Jesus, because the bigotry that we see coming from Israel is not a one-way street. The Samaritans think that the Jews are wrong, the Jews think the Samaritans are wrong, and for the most part, they do their absolute best to just completely avoid each other, to maintain the peace, and stay away from each other. So she goes, why are you asking me for a drink? And Jesus, his response is kind of bizarre, because he goes, why haven't you asked me for a drink? Right? He says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Look at Jesus referring to himself in the third person. It's so cool. But living water, when this woman would have heard that, that's a pretty standard way just to say fresh water, clear water, spring water, running water. And so she knows that the living water is in the well. That's where the fresh water is. And she's looking at this man who's weary, who's dirty from traveling, who's alone out by the well, and thinking, he's got nothing. How is he going to get me water? And she must have been thinking, oh my goodness, this person's crazy. That makes sense why he's talking to me now. And if she's thinking that he's a little bit confused, she responds pretty well. She says, sir, you don't have anything to get the water with, right? The well is deep. Where are you going to do this? How are you going to do this? Are you greater than Jacob? You know, this is his well, right? But Jesus sticks to his guns, and he explains what he meant by living water isn't what she heard by living water. And he explains that anyone who drinks this lousy well water is going to get thirsty again and have to drink more of it in the future. But whoever drinks the water that he gives will never be thirsty again. Now, if she thought he was crazy before, Jesus really isn't helping his case right here. And I've got this Bible, it's an ESV study Bible, and I love it. My wife gave it to me, and it has notes on everything. And the bottom half of every page is just full of good information about the places and the context and the people and the cultures and all sorts of good stuff that just brings it alive for me. But I have to say, I take issue with the way that this commentator interpreted this scene, because the interpreter who wrote a note on verse 15, which is where the woman asks for living water, said that the woman misunderstands Jesus and takes him literally and wants this living water. But I think just to say that is to grossly oversimplify the story and to oversimplify her character. Because if she really is a person, and in order for her to believe this stranger who she just met that is making this outlandish claim, she has to be like the dumbest person ever, right? I mean, imagine if you went to Ralph's and you were out in the parking lot and kind of a tired-looking, dirty guy came up to you alone and said, "Hey, I've got something where if you drink it, you'll never have to drink anything again." It is a sincere hope of mine that no one here would drink whatever was offered you in that moment. So either this woman is just completely naive, completely over-trusting of this stranger who is from an offensive culture to her that she's never spoken to, or what I think is more reasonable is she's got a little bit of an attitude. So when I read that she wants this living water, it's less a, yes, I want this living water, and more like, yeah, give me some of that water. Then I wouldn't have to keep trekking out here with my stoneware jug and carrying water back all the time. That would be great, man. I mean, you think a hydro flask is heavy, right? Try carrying multiple gallons across town in a rock. That's what she had to do. Tough people back then, I'll tell you what. But Jesus takes it up a notch at this point. And she's thinking that he's strange at the very least, and Jesus takes it up a notch and he sets her up. He says, "Well, why don't you go get your husband?" "Well, I don't have a husband." "That's right. In fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the guy that you're with right now, he's not your husband." Talk about getting real quick, right? Talk about being called out. But that's what convinces her. That's what shifts him in her mind from this kind of crazy person to this person who knows things that he shouldn't know. And we see this shift in her attitude here. "Oh, I see. You're a prophet." And now that she's talking to a prophet, she's talking to somebody who knows some stuff and is clearly, based on the fact that he just went straight for her personal life, not afraid to talk about the hard stuff. Right? And so she asks him a tough question. Who's got it right? Right? We've got the Jews and we've got the Samaritans. We both worship in such different ways. Who is doing it right? As a prophet, he would know. And his response is interesting because it's basically, you're not asking the right question, right? Don't worry about it. Yes, the Jews are right in this context, but the time has come where people will worship not only in truth, but in spirit as well. The time has come where it doesn't matter who is doing everything exactly right, who is checking all the correct boxes. The time has come where we need to think differently about our relationship with God. She's like, "Okay, great. Well, when the Messiah shows up, I'll take it up with him as well." And then Jesus says something to her that he has not yet revealed to the Jews, the people of Israel. He says, "I who speak to you am he," and reveals himself as Messiah to this woman who he just met at the well. And what convinced her? What really pushed her over the edge from thinking he's just some weird guy out by the well all by himself who could probably use a bath, right? Because at this point, he's in Samaria. He doesn't have the reputation he does in Israel. He doesn't have his disciples with him to back him up and to give him any sort of credibility at this point. He's a guy by himself making impossible promises and impossible claims to a woman who has never seen him before and who is uncomfortable speaking to him, and she doesn't take him seriously. But then he calls her out, and that's what shifts him in her mind. Because he recognized the larger brokenness behind this really small tidbit of an admission that she gave him, right? She said, I have no husband. Yes, that is an admission, because in her culture, she's too old to not have a husband. So that's not something she would really probably be broadcasting. But Jesus sees so much more, because she admits she has no husband, but Jesus says, actually, I know that's true, but there's so much more brokenness in your life as well. And that got her attention, because he saw what was really going on. He saw the real reason that she was coming to the well at noon, instead of earlier in the morning when it's cooler and when all the women would normally have come to the well. He saw the reason she would do that is because as a woman who's been married 5 times and is now living with a guy she's not married to, she's a social pariah. She is not someone who's like a cool person to be hanging out with. And it's really easy to deal with people who judge you if you just avoid them. It's really easy to deal with people who aren't like you if you just stay away from them. So that's likely what was going on, why she's there at noon. In fact, this is exactly what the Jews and the Samaritans have been doing for hundreds of years. So they've got a good example there. This is what men and women would have to do in public. So they've got a good example there. This is what this woman and the people of Sychar had been doing as well. But that intimacy of that moment with Jesus changed that woman, because he saw her and he knew her and he knew her faults, her weaknesses, her shortcomings, and still he offered her that living water that could only come from him. And when he did, something changed, because what happens next is remarkable. Because this woman who shows up at the well at noon, so she doesn't have to be around these people who judge and ridicule her, runs back to town to go find those people and tell them about this teacher at the well who they need to get connected with. And she's spreading this message to people who didn't like her, who disapprove of her, who at very least look down on her lifestyle. But this moment when Jesus looked at her and saw her and told her he knew the real her, changed her. And I don't know who needs to hear this tonight. Maybe it's just me. If so, I'll watch this on YouTube later and it'll hit me. But Jesus sees you. And Jesus sees the whole you, the real you, the good, the bad, the ugly, and he loves you. A lot of times it can feel to me like it's more of an either-or type of situation, right? Like okay, someone can either love me or know me, right? Like Jesus, if he really loves me, he probably doesn't know me, right? And if he knows me, there's no way that he loves me. And I know I'm not the only one who thinks like that sometimes, and I know that is incorrect thinking. We've talked quite a bit this semester about getting real with ourselves, getting real with others, and getting real with God. And we're not done talking about getting real with ourselves and getting real with others. Last week, we practiced getting real with God by praying through some of these Psalms. Last week in our life groups, we talked about what getting real with God looks like in different people's lives. But if we're going to be talking about getting real with God, we need to understand just how real he wants to get with us. Because Jesus wants to get all the way real. Totally real. Not just kind of real. Not just I have no husband real, but I've had 5 and am currently not married real. I oftentimes think about my pride. And I think about the fact that I tend to be a pretty prideful person. I tend to struggle with that and want to change that. And I pray about that. And that's something that I'm pretty comfortable doing, and even comfortable sharing here, because it's kind of innocuous enough that it's not something that is deeply shaming or deeply problematic in my life. However, something I don't pray about as much is my selfishness, specifically the ways that manifests itself in the way I treat my wife and my friends and my family, and the way I treat my coworkers. And I know that if I were to get all the way real with God about that, it would mean some stuff. It would mean that I had to change things about the way I interact with those people. It would mean that I would have to have uncomfortable conversations with uncomfortable people. It would mean that I have to change the way I interact with the people who surround me on a daily basis. It would mean I would have to make phone calls to people who aren't here, but I love, but I'm now too self-absorbed to make the time for. If you know me, you know I hate talking on the phone. But when I read this story with my get real glasses on, I realize that we need to, and that I need that kind of disruption in my life. And there's three things that jump out at me about this story. The first one is that this wouldn't have happened, this interaction would not have ever happened had Jesus not been willing to go straight up the gut of Samaria and break cultural boundaries and break cultural norms and societal norms and talk to a woman, and then to break personal boundaries and call out the brokenness in her life. It wouldn't have happened. But he was willing to do that, and he's willing to do that for us too. The second one is that this woman was surprised, right? She didn't wake up that morning expecting to meet the Messiah. She didn't expect that morning to meet the Savior of the world. She left her house, she grabbed her water jug and went to go do a chore that she did every day by herself. And she met this stranger in an otherwise extremely familiar place. And she came back totally changed. And she wouldn't have come back totally changed if she had let that surprise scare her off. If as soon as Jesus said, I see this brokenness in you, if she had run away at that point, she wouldn't have been changed. When we hear from God, the thing to do is listen. Even when it's surprising, especially when it's uncomfortable. The third thing that I see when I read this story is that interaction, that beautiful picture of Jesus as Messiah would have died with her had she not gone and shared it immediately. It says that she left her jug there, probably so she could run faster, and went straight to tell people about this teacher at the well. And they invite him to stay in Samaria, and he does for a couple days. And when he leaves a couple days later, he leaves behind him a changed people. And that hangs on her shoulders in the fact that she was willing to go share. So this week I have a couple challenges for all of us, okay? This week I challenge you to encounter God in places that are so familiar to you that you've begun to miss out on his presence in those. Maybe that's your bed, spend a lot of time there. Maybe that's class, maybe that's work. Who knows what it is, but seek to encounter God in those spaces that are so familiar to you. Second one is listen for what God is saying to you in those spaces and in others. Because it's only then that we can follow what he is trying to tell us to do. And the third challenge that I have is to respond to what he is saying to you by inviting other people into that with you. And by allowing that living water that only comes from him to overflow onto the people around you so they too can experience the transformation of Jesus. There's big things happening on this campus this year. The Holy Spirit's moving in big ways, and I'm excited to be here for it. And my prayer for all of us is that our ears are open to the guidance and to the direction that God is giving to us. My prayer is that our hearts are soft enough to be sensitive to that and change how we do things in all areas of our lives so that we can undergo changes that make us look and live and love more like Jesus every day. If there's something that is on your heart tonight, if there's something that you think of in the next few songs that you want prayer for, I urge you to seek out somebody, either in the back or somebody you came with, and pray with them. Listen for God with them tonight. Will you bow your heads and pray with me?